This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Noah Adams.
And I'm Robert Siegel. Today, 538 Americans voted for president. And for the first time since 1888, a majority of the Electoral College went to the loser of the popular vote. The final tally in this year's presidential election is 271 for George Bush, 267 for Al Gore. The Electoral College strikes some people, like political scientist Stephen Wayne of Georgetown University, as out of place in modern America.
The fact of the matter is, it's not fair. It's not democratic.
But this 18th century brainchild of the framers of the Constitution has many defenders. For example, Columbia University historian Alan Brinkley. He says there's nothing inherently undemocratic about it, and it does have some utility.
The Electoral College, through most of our history, has pretty faithfully reflected the popular vote, often has magnified the margin in close elections, which I think has been helpful rather than harmful, and only occasionally has produced messes like it produced this year.
But Stephen Wayne, who would like us to drop out of the Electoral College, says messes like this year are waiting to happen as long as we pick our presidents the way we do.
We've been lucky. I mean, I had my appendix out last week, and it never produced any trouble until one Sunday I started getting pains. We've been very, very lucky.
In this part of the program, we're going to imagine some alternatives to the Electoral College system. But first, a reminder of how it works. Each state casts a number of electoral votes equal to the sum of its senators and representatives. Every state has 2 senators, and the smallest states have at least 1 House member, so the smallest states have 3 votes, and in this one instance, Washington, D.C. is treated like a small state. The biggest state, California, has 54 votes. By tradition and state law, nearly all the states give their electoral votes in a block to the candidate who wins the state, whether by a landslide or by a hair's breadth. And that's why almost 6 weeks ago we were riveted to the result from one big state.
2 a.m. on the East Coast. This is Election 2000, almost as it really was. The entire nation waits to see who will win Florida's 25 electoral votes. Given the electoral map as we now see it, whoever wins Florida wins the White House. Michigan
But
and
what if the last 2,000 votes that were counted in Florida were no different than any other votes? What if we simply voted nationwide for president, counted the votes nationwide, and called the one with the most votes the winner?
11 p.m. on the East Coast, Election 2000, as it might have been if the framers hadn't had to worry about federalism or mistrusted the electorate. The presidential race is close. Bush is running slightly ahead of Gore. But now we're going to see the vote totals come in from the Pacific Coast, where Gore is strong. Based on the exit polls, we're calling it for Gore.
If we actually chose the president this way, presidential election campaigns would be different. Political scientist Stephen Wayne says they would be better.
The candidates would not just campaign in 14 or 18 states as they did in 2000, but they'd campaign across the country. They'd even campaign in states where they were ahead because it was important to bring out their vote. California would probably see more of the election than it did right now because Gore didn't advertise in California at all. The Democrats didn't advertise because they were so confident, and there was very little advertising in New York.
And that, says historian Alan Brinkley, is precisely the problem.
If there were a straight popular vote, then I think the character of campaigning would change remarkably. First of all, what little remains of retail campaigning, on-the-ground campaigning in particular states that are very close, I think would very quickly disappear. You'd have an entirely televised campaign with the activities of the candidates, even more than they are now, aimed at television images rather than reaching voters. Not even television images on local stations, but national television images.
Stephen Wayne admits that this would lead to more campaigning in the big populous states where the margin of victory would be all important, and the little states would get less attention than they do now.
Vermont and New Hampshire and Maine in the Northeast and some of the Rocky Mountain states, they would probably suffer more.
Which isn't to say they aren't suffering from neglect, as it is. According to the National Journal, in this year's presidential election, there were 14 small states with a total of 61 electoral votes, that did not see a visit from a national candidate, Democrat or Republican, at any time from April 1st through Election Day. A national popular vote would require a constitutional amendment. That would mean a lot of states, big and small, would have to agree to surrender their present advantages. It's not so likely. There are some reform schemes, though, that don't eliminate the Electoral College, but change the way it allocates votes. For example, two states, Nebraska and Maine, don't necessarily cast their votes in a block. They give 2 votes to the statewide winner, and the other electoral votes are awarded by congressional district. If the winner in Nebraska lost the popular vote in one of the state's 3 congressional districts, that candidate would get 4 of Nebraska's 5 votes. Well, last week, USA Today figured out what would have happened this year if that had been the system all over the country.
Election 2000 as it might have been. 3 days after the polls closed, we have now counted Tuesday's presidential vote in all 435 congressional districts, some of which overlap counties and are almost impossible to tally. Here is the result. George Bush, 271 electoral votes. Al Gore, 267. George Bush is the next president.
That's right. USA Today found that if the Nebraska-Maine system were applied nationwide, even though Gore won the popular vote, the result in the Electoral College would have been absolutely the same. Stephen Wayne ran the numbers on another Electoral College variant. Allot each state's electoral votes proportionally to the popular vote in that state.
The total would have been George W. Bush, 260.2 electoral votes, Al Gore, 258.4 electoral votes, and probably Ralph Nader, 19.4 electoral votes. Under that system, then, Bush is the plurality winner, but not the majority winner. If you still required a majority of electoral votes to be the president, that would give Ralph Nader quite a bit of influence because his votes could elect Al Gore.
Historian Alan Brinkley speaks of another reform proposal: keep the winner-take-all system, but make each state's electoral vote more representative of population.
At present, each state gets at least 3, 1 for each of its senators and 1 for every congressman. And that magnifies the influence of small states and makes the electoral result much more out of keeping with the popular result than it might otherwise be. If we eliminated the senatorial electoral votes, in effect, and gave each state only the number of electoral votes that it has members of the House, then we get, I think, a more accurate reflection of the popular vote in the electoral vote.
I mean, so in that case, the state of Florida, now with 25 electoral votes, would have 23, its number of House districts. Wyoming, with 3, would have 1.
That's right.
Two a.m. Wednesday, November 8th, election 2000, as it might have been with only 436 electoral votes. The last big batch of electoral votes, Florida's appear to be headed for the GOP column. But under the new system, Bush's victories in 30 states get him 60 fewer electoral votes than they used to. So we're calling it Gore 225, Bush 211. And that talk we heard earlier about the Democrats calling for a recount in Florida would seem to be unnecessary at this point, given the Democratic...
A partial reform like this one doesn't wash with political scientist Stephen Wayne. He says, just count the votes.
The reason you want a direct election is that's the only system you can have where all votes count equally. And that's one person, one vote is the principle on which our electoral system is and should be predicated.
But for practical reasons, historian Alan Brinkley says the complete elimination of the Electoral College would be a disaster.
I think the worst solution would be to go to a straight popular vote. I think in an election like the election we've just concluded, all the problems we saw in Florida would be magnified, 50-fold in an election this close. The problems of recounts and challenges. Every precinct in the United States would be up for grabs.
Our two scholars agreed that the 2000 presidential election, while it underscored the electoral system's capacity for making the loser of the popular vote the winner, also gave a black eye to the fine tradition of popular suffrage. They both say, get new machines before attempting anything so bold as a national plebiscite to pick our national leader. All of which brings a smile to the face of Patrice Dubert.
We tried your system for just one election, and it didn't work. Nobody liked it. And we went straight to the popular vote.
Monsieur Dubert is Washington correspondent for the French newspaper Le Monde. And when they pick a president, the French apparently make what we find impossible very simple.
All the candidates that get a minimum of support from elected officials around the country can stand for election. Let's say you would have 2 or 3 major candidates, and then one or two Ralph Naders or Pat Buchanans.
And if none of those candidates achieves an outright majority, 50% of the vote, then there's a runoff.
There's a runoff 2 weeks later.
And the French, who are notoriously technophile and gadget-friendly, do this without punch cards or optical scanners or touchscreen voting machines.
We have a highly sophisticated voting system, which makes so that within 3, 4, 5 hours, we know exactly who got how many votes. This highly sophisticated system is called ballot papers. Each candidate has a piece of paper where his name is written. So you pick up all the papers, put the ballot paper of your favorite candidate in an envelope, put the envelope in a ballot box, and then at the end of the day, we count the votes. All votes are counted, and we get the results. And if we need a recount, it's done overnight, and we don't have to wait 5 weeks.
Yes, France is a smaller country, and you might think the French wouldn't share our concerns about election fraud. But Patrice Dubert says the graveyard vote is not unknown in France.
It used to happen in places like Corsica, where we used to have dead people voting. But you've done better. You've elected a dead man.
So, together with Sunday voting and uniform polling hours, the French system, if it were adopted here, might have led us to this conclusion.
8 p.m. Sunday, November 19th, election 2000, a la Française. The 24-hour national voting period for the presidential runoff is over. The polls are closed from Maine to Hawaii. The result is Gore, 51%, Bush, 49%. But if our exit polls...
A conversion to the French system seems very unlikely. Talk about improving and standardizing the way we count and recount votes is much more common this season than talk about reforming the Electoral College. Perhaps the 5-week wait for an agreed result in Florida overshadowed the other remarkable fact of the 2000 election, that for the 4th time in our history, the Electoral College formula worked against the winner of the popular vote.